It's good to see that you're doing lots of other media around public ownership. This week, obviously, Keir Starmer's come up with Labour's policy on the energy crisis. I'd just like to play you a video of what Keir Starmer said on BBC Radio, and maybe you could speak after about what you think about this.
We're in an emergency situation now where millions of families are simply not going to be able to pay their bills this autumn if we don't do something about it. Under our plan, fully costed, every single penny will go on keeping those prices frozen and not allowing them to go up. So every single penny is going precisely, every penny, to stopping those bills so that every family, every household will benefit.
But you could argue, but the way you're doing it is by propping up the energy companies, and given the scale of money that we're talking about. Let me give you the second half of the
point I'm trying to make. If we were to add nationalisation to our plan and add more cost to it through that, that would mean using the money to pay shareholders, because you don't nationalise for free. You've got to compensate the shareholders. So I would be having to come on your programme and say, I'm going to use X billion pounds not to reduce the bills for millions of people in the autumn, but actually to compensate shareholders.
But it would give you control over those energy companies.
In an emergency, I just don't think that's the right choice.
But the TUC is saying that they're saying that it would be £2.5 billion to renationalise the energy company. I don't know whether you've looked at how much it might cost, but given that you're looking at 30 billion over 6 months and you haven't ruled out taking further action, could be 60 billion over the course of a year, why not spend that money on renationalising the companies and then give security to their customers?
Because in an emergency like this, I think every penny should be used to reduce the bills of households across the country, not used to compensate shareholders in energy companies.
Yeah, now, Kat, there's one thing he says in there that I'd like to check with you. He says you don't nationalise for free, and he's talking about it costing a lot of money to nationalise energy. Is that true?
So it depends which bit of the energy system we're talking about. So there are a number of things that the government or Labour could commit to doing for free or for very, very low cost. So, for example, right now, Bulb, the private company Bulb, has collapsed. It collapsed at the end of last year with 1.7 million customers. It's had to be taken into administration by the government. So the government is propping it up. They are planning to spend £2.2 billion propping up Bulb as a private company, or propping it up and then returning it back to the private sector. So 2.2 billion. They're now looking at whether to pay Octopus, another private company, to buy Bulb, to take over Bulb, instead of using those 1.7 million customers as the basis of a publicly owned energy supply company, which is a very normal thing to have in other countries. So France, Germany, Italy, the US, they all have publicly owned energy supply companies. It's a normal thing to do. And so we could create that right now from Bulb, which has already collapsed. And that would be in a position to compete with the big five. That would be in a position to, if it was providing us a better deal on our energy bill, people could just switch into the publicly owned provider. And that would be a way where the big five might indeed lose a lot of customers. And, we would have a publicly owned supplier that was supplying a lot of people. So that's one thing they could do, not just cost free, saving money, keeping Bulb in public ownership, and actually taking that opportunity. And, other countries do that. So in France, they have publicly owned EDF. They've kept their bill rises to 4%. The state has said, we're going to take the hit. And they've kept their bill rises at 4%. We're looking at possibly energy bills of £500 a month in January, just unbelievable prices. So other countries already do that. That's an easy thing that they can do, that Labour could be promising, that the government could be doing. And the fact that they're not doing that makes it seem very, very ideological, the idea that we have to put Bulb back in the private sector when the private supply market has been in absolute chaos with lots of suppliers folding. The other thing about having Bulb as a public energy supplier is that when new companies collapse, they can all be brought into that public supply company. So that's one thing. I'm sorry to give you a complicated
answer. No, that's fine.
There's quite a lot of different aspects. Another thing that the government could do and that Labour could commit to do for very low cost is they could set up a state-owned renewable generation company. Again, they could use the new public supplier. They could add an aspect to its role where it is using our wind and water and solar power, and being a publicly owned state-owned renewable generation company for the UK. The advantage of that is the profits flow back to us. We're making the most of our natural resources, and that's another way to bring down energy bills. So you're not paying out money to shareholders, but you also have control over generation, and you can drive that forward. And what the academic evidence shows is that public generation companies are really driving the green transition. So if you look at the top, we need to be doing that. We need to be weaning ourselves off gas, having more green energy. If you look at the top 10 green countries that are doing best in terms of the green transition, 9 out of 10 of them have a publicly owned renewable generation company. Guess which one doesn't? That's us. We're the only country out of those top 10 green leaders that has not bothered to set up our own company to benefit the people of this country, to make the most of our natural resources. Countries like Norway, France, Sweden, Finland, Iceland, New Zealand, they all have a company where they have at least a 50% public stake. So that's another thing that doesn't cost money. Yes, there's a setup cost. That's fairly minimal. Then it makes money for the country. There's no shareholders to buy back, to compensate, not an issue. Then it comes to the question, and I think, Starmer was picking up on this question of the TUC report, which is about the big five. Now, the TUC's done some brilliant research on this, and what they've said is that it would cost around £2.85 billion to compensate the shareholders of the big five retail companies who cover around 70% of UK customers. The thing is, that's not actually very much money in the scheme of things, and when you compare it to the fact that the government is already planning to spend £2.2 billion propping up Bulb, it's not a huge amount of money, and it would give them a government control and the ability to quickly do something about people's energy bills. So I do think that they should absolutely be looking at that. They should be bringing as much supply as possible into public ownership. The TUC has shown how affordable it would be. Not just that, but it's also about planning for the future. Labour is talking about a mass insulation programme of our homes. How is it going to deliver that? Public ownership it's not just about not wasting money on shareholders' dividends. It's also about planning for the future and delivering things for the country that we need. So if you have publicly owned supply companies, they could do that work of going from house to house, upgrading, retrofitting people's properties so that we have much more efficient properties for the future. So that's another thing. Public ownership is a tool. Final thing I'll just talk about to answer your question is the cost of buying back the grid. So you have the generation, you have the transmission and distribution, then you have supply. So I've talked a bit about supply and generation. Transmission and distribution, those are all private monopolies. So you have the national grid transmitting the electricity and gas, sort of high voltage, long distance, and then you have the distribution companies, which are regional monopolies, which bring the energy to our homes and to our businesses, etc. Those are all private monopolies. We're almost the only country in Europe that has chosen to have a privatized grid. And that has lots of disadvantages. It means that we're paying out dividends to shareholders, who, by the way, mostly aren't even in this country. So if you're in the northeast, your electricity is brought to you by a Northern Power Grid, which is owned by the US billionaire Warren Buffett. If you're in London, your electricity is brought to you by a company that is owned by a Hong Kong billionaire, Li Ka-shing. He got a 237 million payout for running that company last year. So, a lot of people, well, not a lot of people, a handful of people are making a lot of money from these monopolies where you don't have any choice. And actually, there is no market. And so would we have to pay to compensate shareholders to take back the grid? Yes. Would it be a good deal for the public purse? Yes, it would, absolutely, because we'd then make around £3.7 billion a year, because we wouldn't be wasting this money on shareholders. We would have lower borrowing costs in the public sector. It is an asset that we should own and control as a country. That also, by the way, makes it easier to plan, to link up, community renewable projects to the grid. These companies have been pretty slow to sort of advance that agenda. And it's not actually such an out there radical idea. So right now, this Conservative government has actually decided to take some of the National Grid's duties off it already to create what they're calling a future system operator. So by 2024, we will have a publicly owned future system operator, and that has been created so that it can do some planning for net zero. The government has acknowledged that the best solution is to have that in public ownership. And so what they're actually doing is just quietly, not talking about it loudly, they are implementing legislation and compensating the shareholders of National Grid for taking those duties off National Grid. And they're just getting on with it. So, the idea that we can't ever compensate shareholders and get back assets that rightfully belong to the people of this country that we can use to deal with climate crisis, to deal with all of the issues that we have, outrageous energy bills. We can do that. That is something that the government has done when it needs to, and it just doesn't bang on about it because it doesn't fit with the ideology that private companies must do everything.
And he's also said, hasn't he, that he'll spend, if he were Prime Minister, he'd spend 29 billion on subsidising bills, and that money would all go to the private companies that run energy. So that's a lot more money than the money you mentioned the TUC had said. I mean, that's 10 times more money than the TUC money. So I can't understand how he would think that it's unaffordable. It just seems contradictory.
Exactly. We have to be investing. We have to be investing in green energy. We have to be investing, in getting to our climate targets. We have to be spending money to make life livable for people right now. If you're going to spend all that money, why spend it on companies that you don't have any control over, instead of actually having some control over a public company in the system and, choosing to take back our assets so that we actually have control over those. Energy is something that needs to work for all of us paying our bills, and we need to be getting much greener energy much quicker so that we don't end up in this kind of situation in the future. And the only way that you can do that is by planning ahead in the public sector and delivering that, having an actual plan for it. You can't just expect a handful of different private companies who are working for their shareholders to sort of deliver that off their own bat.